Hey, how's it going, everyone? Thanks for joining me on a new episode of the Music Reviewer Podcast. My name's Josh, and thanks for joining me on this episode of Worth the Listen. I know Worth the Listen is our least utilized segment on here, but I think since it's towards the end of the year, this will be a good opportunity to incorporate this segment more, just because some of the more prominent album releases are slowing down. So with that in mind, I think since I'm not dying to review an album at this point in time, I can kind of explore this side of the podcast a little bit more. And if you're new to the Music Reviewer Podcast as well, thanks for joining me. My name's Josh. I'm just a guy that loves talking about music, and hopefully you are into that as well. Or maybe you just tuned in because this is a white lung Worth the Listen. Anyways, welcome. All Worth the Listen is instead of me covering or reviewing an album like standard, this album would have had to fall out of the 1 month time frame after it was released. So usually Worth the Listen is sort of a classics review, but I don't like to use classics. Something that left an impression from the numerous amounts of albums and bands I've listened to or artists that I've listened to. Just something that has stuck out. I am no way proclaiming that these albums are classic or that they're a definitive example of what good music should be. This is just my opinion. And the last album I covered on Worth the Listen was actually over Tori Ma's Anything in Return, which that solid showwave album that came out in the early 2010s, I believe. And before that, the first Worth the Listen ever was over the Japanese house debut album, Always Good at Falling. And that one was an album I missed last year. And that seems to be a pattern with me. I tend to sometimes write off an act or an album. And when I come around to it, I end up being such an idiot because I'm like, wow, where was I when this came out? And I could have been sort of out there with everyone else celebrating a great album. That happened with Anything in Return too. It took me a couple years after its release to really understand or acknowledge that I really like Tori Ma. And also recently with Dorian Electra. That's one artist that took me a while to actually devote some time listening to. And what do you know? I'm a big Dorian Electra fan now. This album that we're reviewing today by White Lung, titled Paradise, released April 6, 2016, is not so much the case. White Lung kind of just came to me randomly one day when I was probably just doing nothing, being lazy after a long day of classes in college. A lot of my discovering of music around that time was just me laying on the couch or in front of the TV and looking at what's suggested on YouTube. And a lot of those performances were from a live performance from like a KEXP studio, or something of that nature, maybe a tiny desk here and there. And one day what happened is I believe I clicked on the live performance in a KEXP studio below, the third track on this album. And I think I either really ended up liking the song and loving the album, or loving the band, that I ended up, I guess, listening to the studio version, which made me really like the band even more. That kind of became my introduction to White Lung. That sort of process happened to several other bands over the course of my college days and beyond. And I guess in a way, I was a bit of an idiot, and I discovered there was probably several missed opportunities to see White Lung live too. When all the way back between 2012 and 2016, because I was living in Austin around the time, and they came through several times. Probably at music festivals I attended as well. I just didn't know they existed. But yeah, Paradise by White Lung. Yeah, where do we start with this album? Like I said, I discovered White Lung on accident on YouTube. I think I went through, for the first month or so of listening to them, through most of all of their albums. I noticed that their earlier stuff, right before Paradise, that I at least consumed, was very much more set in like a punk aesthetic, a traditional punk aesthetic, where it was more abrasive, fast, shouty in the vocals instead of like sung melodies. But let's go ahead and recap about White Lung as a band. They are a Canadian pop-punk band formed in Vancouver in 2006. The band has released 2 albums on Deranged Records, which were their first 2, and their latest 2 were released on Domino, which, doing that brief amount of research, I was kind of taken aback by that Domino signing. And not to say that's like a crazy signing or it's weird for them to be on Domino, but I tend to gravitate towards stuff on Domino. I don't know if that's just the basic Arctic Monkeys fan in me, because since my high school days, I still am an avid fan of the Arctic Monkeys. But interesting to see that one of these albums on Worth the Listen's on Domino. Early in the band's careers, they received critical acclaim from Canadian and punk publications mostly. Additionally, the band's sophomore album was met with much more critical acclaim, as well as from publications like Spin, Pitchfork, Rolling Stones. So yeah, it seems like for White Lung, they had somewhat humble beginnings from being in this punk scene in Vancouver and becoming one of the more better known, I guess, punk indie darlings in the 2010s, up until this release in 2016, which I think I went back and just for curiosity's sakes, and I think Pitchfork rated Paradise pretty high. Not to say Pitchfork is like the all important authority in this stuff, but I think it was like around 8.5 or 8.6, which, that's not the easiest thing to do, for Pitchfork. Now that was in 2016. The publication has since changed drastically. I don't think it's nearly as hard to get that anymore. But anyway, it wasn't really till around 2014 when the band released their third album, Deep Fantasy, where they saw more commercial success and exposure. Paradise, the fourth album. It was also produced by prominent indie producer Lars Stolfers, who's worked with artists such as Cold War Kids, Foster the People, Local Natives, Health, and even Dorian Electra, as recent as his latest album, I Agenda. I think he did the production on F the World, which is one of the better songs on that track. And that's really an interesting thing because, Cold War Kids, Foster the People, Local Natives are all kind of grouped in that indie alternative festival band thing. But they really don't sound anything alike each other. Like Cold War Kids and Foster the People, they're really not making that similar of tracks. Foster the People is more of like this electronic indie pop, and I'd say Cold War Kids is more lenient on like alternative rock roots that have since gone way more sanitarian pop. And Local Natives are kind of just like the typical hipster guys that are always making pretty accessible indie rock music, but kind of never pushing their sound to more of a poppy thing, because I don't think they want to be known for selling out, even though they probably have the opportunity to do that. And then Health is like a interesting and heavy industrial, experimental, noisy kind of act. And then Dorian Electra is the oddball in themselves. So, enough beating around the bush. Let's finally get down to talking about Paradise. And I think one of the cool things about Paradise is that if you're used to listening to earlier work of White Lung prior to this album, you found an atypical punk performance on a lot of their tracks. You found very fast drum tracks and tempos, an abrasive style played over it, with some shouty vocals, and then some accompanying guitar work to fill in a lot of the melodic material on the music. And a lot of that does seem to stay the same on Paradise, but one of the main things I noticed that this album takes on is just the songwriting, I think. For one, I think they made it obvious changes on tracks like Below, where it's more of a slow down rock, alternative rock track, with some more sensitive nature to it, as opposed to something very straightforward and fast. And then the focal point on a lot of this album being the guitar work, which the guitar work for White Lung is championed by many people as being innovative, creative, and pretty top notch. There's a lot of areas where effects are utilized in very interesting and, creative ways, where you make some unconventional sounds on the guitar to color the music and give you a surreal feeling and atmosphere. That's a big quality of the music that I do appreciate on this album and from the band. Starting from the first track, Deadweight, immediately that track greets you with like an abrasive attitude that this album is just completely consumed by. The track is accentuated by some pretty intricate and dynamic guitar work. The track hits you with this fast and melodic nature that's pretty typical of the guitar work on this track and most of the album. The mix features some pretty gritty bass lines that peek through at times, and the vocal performance is nice as well, with Mish Barbara Way giving this track an even more energy than it already had. She kind of just is putting on the frosting on the cake, and the whole nature of the track overall is just very loud, but there's enough captivating areas for it to remain interesting. The next track I really dig as well, Narcoleptic. I love the supporting nature of the bass line on here with the very trebly tone and the driving eighth notes that are just mixed perfectly well to give an effect on the track. Some sparkly guitar effects that create some pretty ethereal moments and melodies, so kind of going back to the guitar work that I think is cutting edge on this album. And then some pretty great instrumental moments also that happen between transitions of chorus and verses. Everything just flows so smoothly. And there's moments where the guitar work is just so commanding in the track that it really creates an interesting dynamic where the well-executed vocal track is competing with the guitar in terms of what's more captivating. And I think it's an interesting dynamic. Like, if you want to just focus on the guitar work, you can be pretty entertained and, fulfilled if that's what you're really trying to listen to without the vocal. But if you really just want to divert your attention to the vocal performance, that's great as well. It's almost like an audible climax, in my opinion. This next track, Third One Below, I mentioned it at first about my introduction to the band. This track overall is not one of my favorite tracks on this album, but it's still a solid track. On this track, the bass admittedly is a little washed out and muffled here, especially on the more earlier part of the track, but the track is the most different in comparison to the rest of the album. So this track does kind of give you a rest of the very hard-hitting, louder track. And it kind of shows the band's sensitivity in different areas. The track also seems to be the most accessible on this album, with its pop tendencies and the writing being really apparent. Still, I love the really lush moments that are created in the choruses, where the overdriven guitar just plays really well off the vocal line to create a really big sounding moment in the track. And the track is pretty unique overall to White Lung. I don't think they've ever written a track like that. We immediately divert after that track to Kiss Me When I Bleed. This is a very hard-hitting track. This track heavily leans on the band's obvious punk nature. It's in a sense probably the most traditional punk rock track on this album. I really dig the build-up and transition to the chorus on this track. The anticipation that's created leading up to that moment is executed really well. The post-chorus interlude is an eerie and ugly moment that I love as well on this track. And the track is admittedly very crowded on the moments where several guitar tones and notes are all mixing together, and you just kind of have like this color overload in the mix. But it's still a very effective moment. Also, the drum work is pretty solid. I like the choppy style brought in here. And the guitar tones on the Kiss Me When I Bleed refrain are just the right levels of crunchy. After that, we have the track Demented. Same story here on the guitar tone. There's just a really lovely level of crunchiness on the opening guitar tones. They're really great. Another pretty traditional punk rock track. Here we get a return to the fast melodic guitar work that's pretty signature White Lung. And the vocal harmonies on this track are more apparent on here. You definitely get to hear them, and they're nice when you do. The bridge on this track has a very interesting guitar moment that really sounds quite unusual of anything I've ever heard on a rock track before. It's just a very unorthodox way of making a guitar sound. It's a pretty interesting track overall. The track after that, Sister, features a pretty captivating introduction with this fast and thin opening guitar melody that colors the track really well, and there's a lot of fast and technical guitar work that's pretty spectacular here, and it's impressive. It's almost at a pinnacle of what's presented on this album here. A lot of the technicalities and utilization of the guitar doesn't get much better than on this track. The track also has this trebly supporting eighth note bass line that I really dig as well. And there is a level of abrasiveness on this track that is just solid all around. Every facet of this track is just presented with a lot of energy and attitude. It's really captivating. It makes the track really just a well-oiled machine, never really missing a beat and keeping each moment consistent. Next track I really dig as well, probably my favorite track on the album, Hungry. I love the change to the more clean guitar tone on this track. It's a nice dynamic shift. The vocal track is interesting as well, with this doubled vocal effect thrown in, and there's a nice build up and transition to this chorus that's really, really nice. The chorus also is, quite hooky and memorable. Everything about it is just paced so well, and the arrivals on each line are just executed in the vocals very well. At moments, I can hear maybe some U2 influence on the guitar work as well, which I never really noticed until, writing this review. And I really love the driving force the rhythmic section provides on this track as well. It's incredibly consistent. After Hungry, we get I Beg You, which is another banger here. It's a really colorful guitar work greets you on this track, and it's a highlight on the album for sure. We transition to a lead guitar riff on this that's incredibly hooky and memorable as well. The tone on it is just so crunchy and present. It's awesome. Probably the most impressive drum track on this album here too. It's played incredibly well and at a quick tempo. Beat snare hits really add to the overall effect this track has, and there's also some messy and chaotic guitar lines on the verses that give the track a really unusual color, but it's interesting in the context of the track, and the guitar instrumental interlude here is a highlight on the album as well. When those moments happen, we're pretty much here at the latter point of this album on Vegas. Vegas is definitely one of the more angrier and aggressive tracks on this album. The lead guitar riff just gives the track an overall sense of doom and anger. It's executed really well. And then another track where the drum track really just structures the entire song and it's executed quite well. It definitely feels like one of the more underdeveloped tracks on the album though, songwriting wise. But if this is the floor of the album, that means this album's pretty good. And then we close out the album with Paradise. This is a very typical punk style type track. Probably one of the faster tempos found on the album, but it's greeted with another impressive drum track immediately. And the track probably contains the most accessible chorus overall due to its hookiness and overall execution. It's definitely the climax and most memorable moment on this track when we get to the chorus. And the character changes throughout the track, especially in the guitar performance, and the guitar performances, which are really effective as well. There's really no dull moments on this track, and I think that's credited to the guitar work. And that's the end of the album. So, I feel like just talking about it doesn't do it justice. So, like the name of this episode suggests, this album's worth the listen. I'm not saying it's the best album, of all time, or even the punk genre, or even of that year. But it has stuck with me over the years for a reason, I think. And I think it has a great sense of re-listenability, in my opinion. The tracks flow so well into each other, and there's really not a dull moment on this album. I can probably listen to any track on any given day and be happy with what I'm listening to. I just really wish White Lung would come out of their, hiatus. I don't know what they're on. They haven't announced that they're breaking up or taking a break, but it's been a while since we got some music from you guys. So yeah, hopefully maybe 2021 is the year. I'm not holding my breath, but yeah, a single maybe. But yeah, if you stuck around to the end of the episode, thank you for tuning in on Worth the Listen today. Go check out Paradise by White Lung if you get some time. But anyways, thanks for listening to this review, and I'll be reviewing some more music soon. If you happen to be streaming the music reviewer on a podcast service, if you're enjoying it, go ahead and subscribe. Also, if there's a way for you to leave me feedback, like on the YouTube comment section, I'd appreciate that as well, good or bad. Like and subscribe there as well. But nonetheless, take care of yourselves. I'll see y'all later.